Nolan Finley. I am the editorial page editor at the Detroit News. Well, we'd come up here from the South and, we settled in, working class suburbs of Western Wayne County, and that's where our life was. We really didn't engage much with the cities. I mean, my parents worked in factories on the edges of the city, but that was about it. It would be rare for us to have a downtown experience then. We were from a small town in Kentucky where, the engagement between blacks and whites was a lot more common, a lot more every day, because it's a small community, you're on top of each other. I mean, not to say the relations were good, but at least the encounters, the experiences were more common. If you lived out in one of those white suburbs of Western Wayne County at that time, you didn't see many black people, if ever. When the riots occurred, I was 12 years old, and I remember them, very well, and the fear in those suburban communities about what was going to happen, and was it going to reach out there, and were they going to be invaded? And there was a lot of that sort of irrational fear and misunderstanding of what was going on. And I think that was a seminal moment, not just for Detroit, but for this region. We think of the riots as primarily impacting Detroit and African Americans, but they also had a real impact on the region as a whole, and I think they gave birth to the suburban culture here. When you look at, at the generational break that occurred for a lot of people whose families had been in Detroit and lived in the same neighborhoods for generations, all of a sudden left Detroit and slammed the door, and it was a true break. They never looked back, and I'm talking, to groups all the time. There's older people in the groups, and they always have stories of growing up in Detroit, and then their families left. The neighborhoods changed, and then their families left, and they never came back. I mean, for a long time, you talk to people who say, "I never go to Detroit," and sort of instead of having a true central city that was the hub and the core of our region, we had all sorts of cores developing in the suburbs where people can meet all of their needs for the most part without ever going into the central city. And that went on, I think, for the better part of the last 50 years, and we're only now starting to see that change. People coming back or looking at Detroit in a different light, primarily because their grandchildren are here and coming here. And so it's taken that long, probably longer than for any other city affected over those few summers, to get back to start normalizing, what our region should be.
As I understand, you joined the paper mid-70s?
1976, yes.
76.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so obviously quite a bit after,
right.
After the riots.
A decade after the riots, yeah.
What was that experience like? What was happening in Detroit in the media when you stepped on board?
Well, I mean, that was just the start of the Coleman Young era. He was elected, I believe, in 75, and there was the media was still very much representative of the white power structure in this town, and there was a lot of friction, a lot of conflict between the media and the community. There was, I think, we had a hostile view of the community, we as a media in this town, and there was a lot of mistrust. We took a very hard line at the newspaper about the riots, and I think it took a lot of time for the people in this community to trust us again, or to forgive us for that. You go back and look at the things we wrote and how we covered that during the 60s, and I have, and it's really unsettling to see, but it does help you understand, how that mistrust and that frayed relationship, the roots of it. I think it was an inevitability. I think after the riots and the subsequent administrations still didn't deal with the inequities and the discontent, and still didn't effectively put this city back together. It was still a very big black-white divide here, and instead of And you had organizations that come out like New Detroit and Detroit Renaissance, other groups that were really focused on trying to knit it back together. But at a community level, the segregation, I think, got worse. And so, there was a sense at the start of those Coleman Young years that we've got to, in the black community, there was a sense that, we've got to have a say, we've got to have a bigger voice. And they saw that voice in Coleman Young, who was very brilliant and very masterful politician and knew how to touch that sort of sentiment. And, I think the reason today he's so revered is because he was the person who was elected, the first elected official who gave African Americans a voice in this city. In terms of the makeup of the city, this was one of this was a northern industry that needed labor and didn't care if that labor was black and white. And so, a lot of my family came up here to work for the auto industry. A lot of black families came up to work for the auto industry, just like they came from all over the world. And when Henry Ford was hiring all those $5 a day workers, they were hiring black and white and Eastern European and what have you. And it did sort of give this town really its African American roots, its foundation. And for the longest time, and perhaps still today, the people in this region just didn't want to live together. And you look at other places, you look at southern cities who sort of were forced to address their racial divide and forced to sort of work through it and got to where they needed to be or in that direction a lot more quickly than we did. And I think we're still struggling here to be inclusive. And the thing I worry about now, as we sort of see this great rebuilding of Detroit and a rebirth, truly marking the first time since the riots that Detroit is in a sustained positive renaissance, and we've talked about it. For all the time I've been here, and I say that for most of those first 40 years that I worked in Detroit, I come in every day, and the city was something less. Something was missing every day. And for the last few years, every day you come in, and there's something more. There's something new, and that's for the first time since 1967. And so it's taken us a lot longer than it should have. And I worry about us bringing some of the old issues along with us into this rebirth. I think we need to obviously fix our neighborhoods along with downtown. But more than that, we need to make sure, we need to really pay a lot of attention that we're including the people from the community, the people who have been here and stuck it out here. And it's not just all these new folks coming in and say, look, Detroit, as if they're Columbus, and I think that's an area we still need a lot of conversation, a lot of thought.
Well, you speak to inclusiveness in the article you did.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it was heralded, Where Are All the Black People?
Right.
What was the response to that? Were you...
I was probably, of all, I've been at this column writing for 16 years. I've never had more response to a column than that. It just was enormous, and it was, from every perspective you can imagine. I mean, there was a lot of resentment from people who say, well, why are you paying attention to black and white? And if, why shouldn't it be just whoever wants to come and do something? And it should be, and that's good. And, I wanted to stress that, all these new faces here, that's great for Detroit. It's what we need, but we can't forget the old faces. And, you also had resentment from African Americans who said, well, wait a minute, we're here, you just don't see us. And that's true too. But, this sort of was a spur of the moment column that I'd been to a couple of events. I'd been to actually the Detroit Historical Society holiday gala. And I thought, gosh, this is a historical society in the city of Detroit, and 90% or more of the people here are white. And, we were out at taping a show out at Channel 56, and a group came through with 50, they billed as 50 young Detroit leaders, and 49 of them were white. And I'm like, and you started looking around at these groups that were really engaged in the city's comeback, and you just didn't see enough black faces. And I worried about the consequences of that and the resentment that would build. And you start listening to urban radio, and you start hearing people say, you're hearing the voices of the community saying, we're being pushed out, we're being left out, nobody's thinking of us. And I think we got so excited about all the great things and all the cool places like this place, all the cool places coming up that, we didn't notice that, not everybody was in the party. I think it's a very complex and wide problem. We've talked about it, in a series of stories and editorials, columns, by me and others at the Detroit News. There's a lot of cultural gaps and experience gaps and opportunity gaps in the city. And I've talked to some folks who work with entrepreneurs and, talking about how much more difficult it is for a young African American to come in and get finances and the expertise, the advice needed to start even the smaller business. You look at what's happened to the commercial strips in Detroit's neighborhoods over the last 50 years, they've been abandoned. So you have kids growing up never meeting a small business person, where the suburban kids, maybe they grew up and small business was talked at their dinner table every night. And, they could go to mom and dad and get some startup funds, or at least some advice and some help. It's just a lot harder. And, we've had an education failure in this city over the last 50 years too, where too many of our kids get washed out as teenagers in terms of opportunity. They get failed early in life. And so, they're not, you don't have as many folks able to graduate from college and say, hey, I'm going to take a few years and see if I can make this business thing work. It's not the same experience. I think we have to be mindful of that. And you have a richer city if your comeback is more widespread, more people are participating, and it moves out, as it is now, I believe, moves out of the city and into the neighborhoods. And I think it's those African-American entrepreneurs who are going to take it to the neighborhoods, or are more likely to take it to the neighborhoods. And so we need to be nurturing and developing them. And, I don't think it's about, I've had my conservative readers say, it's affirmative action, it's set-aside preferences. I said, no, it's none of that. It's just looking around and saying, what's fair, what's right, what would make us a healthy community, what's good for business. And certainly resentment and division is not good for business. What our hope should be is that everybody in a community like this is working together and trying. We've got a lot of problems to solve, but if we see sort of the benefit in everybody pulling together and working together, but the relations improve on one front and then not on another. It seems like we can never get over that hurdle. And it would be nice to see that I'm getting old, and it would be nice to see this city healthy and whole, and not divided. I used that in a column once that, Faulkner said, you don't love the South because of, you love the South in spite of. And I think we've loved Detroit for a long time in spite of its flaws, its deficiencies, despite not having what every other city has. We're very defensive about it. And I think that's why we were able to get to the place we're at today, because you had a whole lot of people who just loved the place despite all that was wrong, and we're willing to stick around and try to make it right. And I think we're not right yet, but we got a lot more people trying to make it right than we did a decade ago, and certainly more than we had 20 years ago.